Hey there, welcome to Simple and Sacred. My name is Melissa Harding, and we are trying to make theology simple here. We have made it through the first half of the book of Genesis. If you've been with me from the beginning, congratulations. You have made it halfway through this incredible and fascinating book. I hope that God has met you in a really real and personal way. I hope that you have learned as much as I have. It's been fascinating, and God has really met me in such a tender way as we've been studying through this book. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. Today's a great day to jump in because we're going to start with a bit of a recap to refresh ourselves on what we have covered so far in the book of Genesis. Genesis opened with this magnificent display of creation. And what we've been trying to do through this study in Genesis is not to first and foremost find out what does this mean to us, but we're asking the question, what did it mean to them? What did the original audience think about what the author is writing about? And so as Genesis opens up, remember we talked about how Moses is not writing this account of creation as an argument against evolution. Moses is writing this account to show God's people who created the earth and what the purpose of this earth is. God, Yahweh, the supreme God, the most high God, who is the creator, is the one who created the heavens and the earth. Not the gods of the other nations who had fabricated their own stories of how they had created the earth. No, it's Yahweh. Yahweh, the most high, supreme God, the only true God, is the true creator. And he created earth as his temple, as his dwelling place. And so this beautiful creation account shows us that there is one true God. He is the creator, and this earth is the place where he desires to dwell. And so he created Adam and Eve. He created humanity as the prophets, priests, and kings for his temple, for his dwelling place. Humanity was placed here to be God's representatives, to rule on his behalf. They were given dominion over this earth, and their role is to rule as God's image bearers over this earth. We came then to the fall. And we saw the serpent, who was not a talking snake, but rather a serpentine creation. There was some type of serpentine qualities about him. We saw that maybe he was a seraph, maybe also a cherub, a guardian over God's throne room. And he deceives Eve into eating the fruit. And we saw that through this deception that there was actually some type of sorcery going on, and that Adam and Eve and humanity then become indebted to the serpent. Death entered the world, and Adam and Eve were exiled from the Garden of Eden. But God promised in Genesis 3:15 to send someone, an offspring of the woman, would crush the serpent's head. But we're now in a seed war. There's this war between the offspring of the woman and the offspring of the serpent. God promised that they would be at enmity with each other. We're also in a battle for dominion. Who will rule the earth? And we're in a battle for a name. In whose name will humanity trust to get back to Eden? And that brought us to the flood in Genesis chapter 6. As this seed war rages and the battle for dominion and a name grows, we saw how the enemy sought to usurp humanity's right to rule and to prevent the promised serpent crusher from coming. And he does this by corrupting the very genetic line of humanity. Genesis 6, the sons of God took for themselves human wives, and their offspring were the Nephilim. And Noah was the only pure human left. So God starts over with him. The flood was both a pouring out of God's wrath because of sin and a preservation of humanity. God is preserving humanity, and he will fulfill his redemptive promises through humanity. And so the flood is a way of preserving humanity. And we saw after the flood, God makes this covenant with Noah. And in Genesis chapter 9, he says that the sons of Japheth, who will become the Gentiles, will find shelter in the tents of Shem. Shem is the line that the promised seed is going to come through. The name Shem means name. And so this theme of in whose name will humanity trust, we see this at the end of chapter 9, that God is saying that the Gentiles are going to be able to find shelter in the name. And specifically in the name of Shem, meaning it's going to come through his line. There's only one name that will get us back to Eden. And the question is, in whose name will we trust? That brings us to the Tower of Babel. See, the problem is humans didn't want to find shelter in Yahweh's name. They wanted to make a name for themselves, and they would enlist the help of other Elohim. And remember, we've talked about this word several times throughout this study. Elohim is a generic word for God. It can be used to refer to Yahweh, the one true God, but it can also refer to a lowercase g, one of the false gods, who are real entities, created beings, but who have usurped the name for themselves and have gained the worship of the nations. So the people, they build a ziggurat, a temple, and they engage in this ritualistic worship of these other Elohim. So God gives them over to these false gods. We saw that later in Deuteronomy 32, it tells us what happened there, that God gives them over. He scatters them according to the number of the sons of God. And out of the very heart of the rebellion, God calls one man. And through this one man, he is going to bring about his redemptive purposes. He calls one family through which he will bring those scattered nations back to himself. Abraham is blessed so that he will be a blessing. He's going to bless the nations. God is going to bless the nations through Abraham and through Abraham's family. This is God's plan to redeem all people. And he was going to use Israel to do it. He chooses Israel. That's where the line is going to come through. That's who the serpent crusher is going to come through, this family. And through that, the nations would be reclaimed. The nations would be blessed. So Yahweh makes a covenant with Abraham and his descendants. And Abraham believes, and it's credited to him as righteousness. And we saw how Abraham was slow to learn how to walk by faith and not by sight. We saw him take matters into his own hands countless times. We saw him struggle to believe in the promises of God. We saw him lie. We saw him, instead of building altars, we saw him do things his own way. But then we also saw him build altars. We saw him go back again and again and again to Yahweh, to the one true God. And God was faithful, and he fulfills his promises, even though Abraham was unfaithful so many times. Isaac was finally born, and then we saw last week how Abraham finally realized that El Shaddai, God Almighty, the all-sufficient one, the covenant-keeping God, would indeed fulfill his promises to him and his family. Abraham has a son. His son has a wife. Abraham owns land in the promised land. And we've seen glimpses of how this family would indeed bless the nations. And that brings us to chapter 25. And in chapter 5, we come to the end of Abraham's story. In verses 1 through 6, it says, Abraham took another wife, whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan. The sons of Dedan were Asherim, Letushim, and Leomim. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abidah, and Eldah. All these were the children of Keturah. Abraham gave all he had to Isaac. But to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts, and while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward toward the east country. So here we see more children of Abraham. I don't know about you, but I have always just thought of Abraham having two sons. He had Isaac and he had Ishmael. But here we see that he had many sons who became many nations. Do you remember in Genesis 12, God told Abram that he would make him into a great nation? But in chapter 17, when God changes his name to Abraham, he says that he would be the father of many nations, more than just Israel and the Ishmaelites. Here we see lots of nations that have descended from Abraham. And this is one more reminder that everything God says will happen does happen. All of God's promises always come true. And although many of these tribes that we see listed here would become enemies of Israel, it's important to note that none of these people are among the tribes God commanded to annihilate during the conquest of the land. But notice in verse 5, it said that Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. See, the covenant that God made with Abraham is going through Isaac now. Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. Well, what does he have? He has the covenant. He has the promises. He has the blessing. Abraham doesn't disregard his other sons. He gives them gifts. This doesn't imply that Abraham and God only loved Isaac. That's not what this is about at all. But the promise can only go through one son. There's only one line that it can go through, and Isaac is the son of the promise. And so Isaac is now the recipient of this covenant. Isaac is now the recipient of the blessing. In verse 6, it says that Abraham sent his other sons eastward. Whenever we see this idea of moving east, this always signifies worship of other gods, of other deities. And so remember, as we're going through each chapter here, we need to look at Genesis as a whole. We need to have a perspective that doesn't just narrow in on one passage or even one chapter, but looking at in its context in the entirety of the book of Genesis. And the recurring theme that we have seen over and over and over again is the battle for a name. In whose name will humanity trust? And which God will they worship? There's a competition for which God someone could worship. There are real beings behind the false gods of the other nations. And so that's the question here. In whose name will you trust? In which God will you worship? To which God will you offer your worship? And so here we see that the nations that come from Abraham, they worship other gods. They trust in names other than Yahweh. They would have heard about Yahweh. It's not like Abraham was keeping Yahweh a secret only for Isaac. They could have trusted in his name as well, but they choose to trust in other gods, in other names. This is the battle for a name that we're going to see over and over and over again. And it's the same battle that we're in today. In whose name will you trust? It goes on to say in verse 7, these are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with Sarah his wife. After the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac his son, and Isaac settled at Beer-lahai-roi. Abraham, our friend that we have seen come so far, has now been laid to rest after 175 years. One important thing to note here is that Abraham lived 15 years after Jacob and Esau were born. A lot of times when we're looking through these stories and we see these genealogies, at least I do, I think that as soon as someone's life is over, the children and grandchildren, that's when their stories start. But these stories overlap. Their lives overlap. So Jacob and Esau knew Abraham. They were alive at the same time for a period of time. Abraham also lived for 100 years in the promised land. That's a long time to live somewhere. He owns land in the promised land. So remember, as you read further on about the conquest, this land was not stolen land. It belonged to Abraham and his descendants. And another interesting thing is that Isaac and Ishmael come together to bury their father. Ishmael, when he and Hagar are sent off, I think we assume that, okay, he's gone forever, never to be seen again. But here we see him burying his father with Isaac, which is an interesting but also beautiful thing that we're witnessing here. In verses 12 through 18, we then see a list of Ishmael's descendants. And while genealogies can seem boring, and I mean, we've talked about it at length already in the book of Genesis, but they're always telling us something. What is going on here? And there's something really fascinating going on in both the genealogies here in Genesis chapter 25. We see Abraham's descendants through Keturah, and then we see Abraham's descendants through Hagar, through Ishmael. And Isaiah chapter 60 actually gives us some insight into maybe why we're given this information. In verses 1 through 7 of Isaiah 60, it says, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you, and nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. Lift up your eyes all around and see. They all gather together. They come to you. Your sons shall come from afar, and your daughters shall be carried on the hip. Then you shall see and be radiant. Your heart shall thrill and exult, because the abundance of the sea shall be turned to you. The wealth of the nations shall come to you. A multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian, and Ephah, and those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall bring good news, the praises of the Lord. All the flocks of Kedar shall be gathered to you. The rams of Nebaioth shall minister to you. And they shall come with acceptance on my altar, and I will beautify my house." Isaiah is talking about the coming of the Messiah. Isaiah is talking about the coming of the serpent crusher. And did you catch some of the names that are going to be returned? Midian, Ephah, Sheba. Those are Abraham's descendants through Keturah. What about the flocks of Kedar and the rams of Nebaioth? These are the descendants of Ishmael. Do you see this beautiful picture? The promise is going to go through Isaac and his descendants, because the promise can only go through one. We need a Messiah. We need a line for the Messiah to come through. But God is not disregarding the other nations. When the Messiah comes, when Jesus comes, these nations are going to be returned. They're going to be gathered back. Do you see this beautiful picture of what God is doing? Of what this whole purpose is? God does not choose Abraham and his family simply because he loves them and he just wants to bless them because he likes them more than everyone else. The whole plan is to use this family, use this nation, so that the nations can be reclaimed to Yahweh. And these descendants of Abraham that go to the east, these descendants of Abraham in Ishmael, who live in the desert places, God is saying one day they'll be reclaimed. They'll return, and it will be one beautiful house and one beautiful family. What an incredible picture of redemption. What an incredible picture of the fulfillment of the blessings that the nations would be blessed through this family, including the nations of Abraham that weren't Israel. One day the serpent crusher would come through Isaac's line, and this serpent crusher would gather all those who would trust in his name and be part of one beautiful house, one beautiful family. Chapter 25 goes on to talk about Rebekah, Isaac's wife, and her barrenness. And this is a parallel to the story of Sarah and Abraham found in chapters 11 and 12. And these stories are very, very similar. And so we see once again this repetition that the book of Genesis gives us. God keeps doing the same thing over and over again so that we can see that he is faithful and he will keep his promises. Isaac prays for his wife that she would be able to have a child, and God hears his prayer. And that brings us to the story of Jacob and Esau. And we're going to be with these guys for a while. In verse 19, it says, "These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah his wife conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, 'If it is thus, why is this happening to me?' So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger." Now, as we go throughout the story of Jacob, there's going to be all kinds of things that we can uncover through his life and also through Esau, although we don't get as much about him. But one of the big issues that comes up, particularly from this passage right here, is the idea of predestination. And the doctrine of predestination or election is tricky. And it's something that we don't want to brush over, but we also don't want to get too thick in the weeds regarding it. But in simple terms, predestination is the doctrine that God has already chosen in advance who will be saved. And so we see this in Jacob and Esau, that God says the younger will serve the older. And this passage plays a fundamental role in shaping what you believe about predestination. Jacob and Esau are talked about by the prophet Malachi and the apostle Paul. So Romans 9:6-13, the apostle Paul quotes what Malachi says in chapter 1 of Malachi. So in verses 6-13 of Romans 9, it says, But it is not as though the word of God has failed. For not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel. And not all are children of Abraham because they are his offspring, but through Isaac shall your offspring be named. This means that it is not the children of the flesh who are the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted as offspring. For this is what the promise said, about this next time I will return and Sarah will have a son. And not only so, but also when Rebekah had conceived children by one man, our forefather Isaac, though they were not yet born and had done nothing either good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls. She was told, the older will serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob I have loved, and Esau I have hated. And that's the quote from Malachi chapter 1. So what does this mean? What is Malachi saying? What is Paul saying? And what is God saying to Rebekah here? Did God really love Jacob and hate Esau? That seems pretty unfair because, as Paul says, before either of them could have done anything right or wrong, it was already decided. We're not going to solve the dilemma of predestination today. There have been very wise theologians throughout the past 2,000 plus years who have debated this to the point that denominations have been built around this doctrine. And I don't contend to be the expert on this. I can say from the studying that I have done that the Bible is clear that God does in some way choose who is saved, but that we also have free will and we must choose to put our trust in him. How that works, I don't understand, but the Bible is clear on both of those. And so somehow they fit together in his sovereignty and our human minds can't comprehend it. But I do want to talk about this a little bit because I think it's really important and it helps us understand what takes place here, not only for Jacob and Esau, but also for ourselves and how we approach our lives and God and salvation. Paul begins the book of Romans making it clear that everyone is born under God's wrath, both Jew and Gentile. That is clear. We all have the same standing before God. We are born in sin and under God's wrath. And in chapter 8, Paul unravels this idea and this doctrine of predestination. But it's meant as a comfort for Christians. That's what he says in chapter 8, that this is meant to comfort us. It never says for a believer to question if they are part of the elect. A believer is part of the elect. It's not meant to cause fear. It's not meant to cause suspicion. It's meant as a comfort. And then in chapter 9 of Romans, Paul talks about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that they were chosen as the vehicle for which salvation would come. God chooses Abraham, God chooses Isaac, and God chooses Jacob. The doctrine of predestination shows us that it is not about our goodness. Isaiah tells us that there is not one who seeks God, not even one. God has to seek us. And that is good news because we won't in our own flesh. Paul explains that election is given in terms of the promise of a miracle child. And that to be elected, it's something you can't do for yourself. It's something done by someone else. You're elected by others. And so God's choice of a person has absolutely nothing to do with that person's works, good or bad. Here's the deal. God does not owe anyone mercy or compassion. This passage in Romans goes on to say that how God is talking to Moses, and he says, I'll have compassion on who I'll have compassion, and I'll have mercy on who I'll have mercy. And that's something we have to remember. Not one of us is owed God's mercy or God's compassion. We must come to the end of ourselves and our sin. As soon as we think we deserve God's compassion, as soon as we think we deserve God's mercy, we don't understand salvation. We don't understand mercy because it's only given to those who don't deserve it. When we look at Jacob and Esau, and we look at this story unfold, if anyone deserved the blessing, it's Esau, not Jacob. Jacob is a deceiver. Jacob is a schemer. Jacob does all kinds of things to hurt the people around him. He does not deserve the blessing. On the outside, it appears that Esau deserves the blessing. But as we look a little bit further, we're going to realize that neither of them deserved the blessing. And God chose Jacob before either of them had done anything good or bad. But this idea, these words of love and hate, as it says in Romans and Malachi, that Jacob I have loved and Esau I have hated, that seems so harsh. And if you're like me, there's kind of like this, man, that is awful. Poor Esau. Why does God love Jacob and hate Esau? So we see love and hate as opposites, don't we? We see this as black and white. There's either love or there's hate. You can't have both of these. And we also see love and hate connected to emotions. So it's as if God feels love for Jacob or he feels hatred towards Esau. And it actually, what's going on here has nothing to do with emotions, of feeling a sense of love, of feeling a sense of hatred. In this context, love signifies covenantal preference. God is choosing Jacob as the one whom the covenant will go through. Only one son could be the recipient of the covenant. Both of them could not because we need a serpent crusher and he needs to come through one line. And God chose Jacob as the recipient of that promise. And it had nothing to do with whether or not Jacob deserved it, because as we'll see, he most certainly didn't. We also have to look at the story as a whole, okay? So we look at this and we see, well, God chose Jacob and not Esau. And then other places in the Bible, it says that God loved Jacob and hated Esau. So that must mean that God chose Jacob because he hated Esau. But that's the wrong way to look at it. We have to finish the rest of the story in order to understand what's going on here. These twins are born, they grow up, and we find them in this conundrum. We also see that there is a lot of family drama going on. It says that Isaac loved Esau, and it says that Rebekah loved Jacob. And again, this idea of love is more of preference. It doesn't mean that Rebekah hated Esau and that Isaac hated Jacob, but there's a preference here going on. And while we're not inside their minds, we don't know for sure. We can assume that Rebekah told Isaac what God had told her about who the promise would go through, but we're not given that inside information, so we don't quite know the reasoning here. But in verse 29, it says, "Once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, 'Let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted.' Therefore his name was called Edom." There's a play on words going on here because the stew is another word for red, and Edom means red. And so there's this theme of red going on here. Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright now." Esau said, "I'm about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me now." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. A birthright in the ancient Near East included material inheritance, a double portion of the father's estate. But it also included family authority. It was the right to succeed the father as the head of the household and the clan. It also embodied spiritual leadership, the position of the family priest, and the continuation of the divine covenant promises made to Abraham. That's all that was part of this birthright. It wasn't just the material goods. That was part of it, but it was also the authority that this family member had and the spiritual leadership, the continuation of the divine covenant promises made to Abraham. And it was an ancient Babylonian custom that siblings could buy and sell the birthright from each other. But we see here Esau is famished to the point of death. Now, different commentators say that he was exaggerating. He wasn't actually to the point of death because he would have been, on the ground somewhere. We don't actually know what Esau's motivations are. Is he really starving? Is he not? Regardless, he sells his birthright. He sells his birthright for a bowl of stew. It says, "Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright." Throughout the narrative of Jacob and Esau, as I mentioned before, Esau is going to appear to be the better brother, the one more deserving of the blessing, the one more deserving of God's favor. And we look at this, we'll say, God, you should have chosen Esau. But Esau makes some very serious, very fatal decisions and choices. And we don't often look at that level. It says he despised his birthright. Esau is not ignorant of the family he has been born into. Abraham was alive for 15 years of his life. You betcha Abraham told him about what God did. You betcha Abraham told him about being called out from his people, from his family, from his land, from his gods. He would have told these boys all about the covenant, about that time where the word walked between the pieces, about the time that he was visited by those 3 strangers and he had a feast with them. He would have told them about Sodom and Gomorrah. He would have told them about the mistakes that he made in Egypt. He would have told him about the mistakes he made with Abimelech. They would have known these stories. Esau is not ignorant of the family that he has been born into. He would have also heard from Isaac, the story of how Isaac saw Yahweh provide a ram as a substitute on Mount Moriah. See, Esau knows who Yahweh is. Esau knows what it takes to be made righteous. It's faith in Yahweh. And anyone who has faith in Yahweh can be made righteous. This is not about God choosing Jacob to be saved and Esau being chosen to be damned. The choice was, in who would the promised seed come from? And he chose Jacob for that. But it wasn't that Esau is discarded and, oh, now you're damned forever. Esau could be made righteous through faith in Yahweh, just as Abraham and anyone else who puts their trust in Yahweh, who puts their trust in his name, can be made. Esau deliberately chooses not to place his faith in Yahweh. He despises his birthright, and he gives it up for the temporary gratification of what this world can offer. The author of Hebrews gives us a little bit of insight. In chapter 12, verse 15, see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled, that no one is sexually immoral or unholy like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. Esau here is declared unholy, not righteous, and it has nothing to do with whether or not he deserved it, because someone can only be made righteous through faith in Yahweh. That's the only way. Esau despises his birthright. He chooses not to trust in the name of Yahweh. We also see later that he married Canaanite wives. This comes later in the story, but in Genesis and the Old Testament, who you marry is a reflection of which God you worship. Remember how Abraham was so adamant about Isaac finding a wife not from the Canaanites when he told his servant, make sure that he does not marry someone from this land that you're living in, but go back to my people to find a wife for Isaac. Why? Did Abraham hate the people of Canaan? Did he hate people of other cultures? No, it's because the Canaanites worshipped Baal. And who you marry was a reflection of which God you were going to worship. Esau knew this. Esau knew what it meant. We're in a battle for a name. We're in a competition for which God you're going to worship, in which God you're going to place your trust. Isaac reiterates the importance of not finding a wife amongst the Canaanites to Jacob. And so what does Esau do? He marries multiple Canaanite women. And he also marries one of Ishmael's daughters. This is more than Esau just thinking these women are beautiful. This is a deliberate choice by Esau to choose a name other than Yahweh's to place his trust. This is a deliberate choice of Esau to worship the gods of other nations instead of Yahweh. Esau does not place his trust, his faith in Yahweh. So Esau is not a recipient of the blessing. And this is not about who the promised seed would go through. This is about Esau's salvation. When Malachi and Paul say that God loved Jacob and hated Israel, it has nothing to do with emotional feelings. Jacob was in a covenantal relationship with God, and so he received the love, the mercy, the grace, the compassion that's available to those who are in a covenant relationship with God. And it has nothing to do with emotional feelings. Esau could have been in this covenant relationship with Yahweh, even though he wasn't the one chosen to carry on the line. And this is so important for us to understand. Because while God is indeed loving, so much so that he sent his only son as a substitute for us, the recipients of his love, his compassion, his mercy, his grace are those who put their faith in him. We don't deserve any of this. We're not given what we deserve. That's the good news of the gospel. Even our faith is not our own doing. He must seek us and save us. But those who do not place their faith in him will receive what they deserve, and that is punishment for their sin. So what are our takeaways here? The genealogies in the first part of this chapter are a beautiful reminder of what God is doing through Abraham's family. Abraham's sons are sent to the east so that the promise can be fulfilled through Isaac. But it's for the purpose of bringing them back in. Abraham's descendants are blessed so that they will be a blessing. And the Great Commission is the fulfillment of Isaiah 60. Jesus says, go into all the world and make disciples of who? The nations. Bring them back, gather them back so we can make one family, one nation, one people, one church, one body in Christ. That is what he does. The serpent crusher comes to reclaim those nations, and now he uses us, his people, to bring about that, to bless the nations. God's heart is to gather the nations back to one family, one bride through Jesus. Secondly, instead of splitting hairs over the doctrine of predestination, what we can take away from this is that the Bible is clear that there is only one name given to men by which we must be saved, and that name is Jesus. Whoever believes in him will not perish, but will have eternal life. In whose name are you trusting? Which God are you worshiping? Your salvation has nothing to do with whether or not you think you deserve it. In fact, if you think you deserve it, then you don't have it. Because it's only for those who acknowledge that they don't deserve it, that there's nothing that we can do. We have no righteousness of our own, no good works of our own. We are desperate for mercy. And those who receive that don't get what they deserve, because we don't deserve mercy, love, forgiveness, compassion, and grace. Esau despised his birthright. He chose the temporary satisfaction of what this world could offer rather than the eternal blessings found in Yahweh. So in whose name will you trust today? Which God will you choose to worship? There's only one path back to Eden. Find shelter, find hope, mercy, grace, and steadfast love in the name of Yahweh today. Have a great week.